Joseph Smith secretly practiced polygamy and polyandry, or what the Mormon Church later called plural marriage. When forced, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints freely admits that today, whereas previously it was denied as anti-Mormon lies. It's a strange hill to die on, isn't it? Because the church was well known for practicing polygamy in the 1800s in Utah. Instead, the church advanced the narrative that Brigham Young was the one who instituted polygamy, even though we know better now. And yet Joseph Smith publicly denied practicing polygamy, keeping the practice to his inner circle, although he slowly began to teach it to others towards the end of his life. He eventually brought most of the early church leaders into that secret circle, save for a few who rejected his invitation and eventually exposed him in the Nauvoo Expositor, an event which ultimately led to his death, since he destroyed the press and was taken to jail for the last time before he was killed. Joseph Smith proposed secret marriages to many women, and yet some of those deliberated too long for the prophet of the Restoration's liking. So Joseph resorted to telling many of them that he was commanded to practice polygamy under the threat of divine punishment. Joseph claimed multiple times that an angel appeared to him with a drawn sword, compelling him to institute and personally practice plural marriage as part of the restored gospel. This narrative is often used to show Joseph's reluctance and the controversial introduction of polygamy into the early church as something God commanded and us mortals can't be expected to understand. Joseph described being visited by an angel multiple times who on the third visit appeared with a drawn sword. The angel allegedly told Joseph that if he did not immediately begin the practice of plural marriage, he would be destroyed or his prophetic call would be revoked. The church accounts portray Joseph initially as reluctant to obey the commandment, but that he ultimately complied due to the fear of divine punishment. Following these alleged visitations, Joseph began practicing polygamy secretly. He took multiple wives and taught it to select followers, which of course led to significant controversy, both within the church and the broader public. And before we go any further, I'm D-Bays with the Mormon News Roundup. I'm glad to have you on board. And you can find a full episode where I detail the complete history of polygamy in the Mormon Church, including documenting beyond question Joseph Smith's practice in polygamy right here.
Many wives.
Now, the Mormon Church has released several gospel topics essays dealing with the subject of polygamy. Let's check out an excerpt from its apologetics over this issue.
Many details about the early practice of plural marriage are unknown. Plural marriage was introduced among the early saints incrementally, and participants were asked to keep their actions confidential. They did not discuss their experiences publicly or in writing until after the Latter-day Saints had moved to Utah and church leaders had publicly acknowledged the practice. The historical record of early plural marriage is therefore thin. Few records of the time provide details, and later reminiscences are not always reliable. Some ambiguity will always accompany our knowledge about this issue. Like the participants, we see through a glass, darkly, and are asked to walk by faith. When God commands a difficult task, He sometimes sends additional messengers to encourage His people to obey. Consistent with this pattern, Joseph told associates that an angel appeared to him 3 times between 1834 and 1842 and commanded him to proceed with plural marriage when he hesitated to move forward. During the third and final appearance, the angel came with a drawn sword, threatening Joseph with destruction unless he went forward and obeyed the commandment fully.
So the church wants to paint this story that because the polygamy commandment was such a difficult task, God sent messengers to encourage Joseph. They rationalize that this is simply how God operates and state that between 1834 and 1842, an angel appears to Joseph, and during the third and final appearance, the angel came with a drawn sword and threatened Joseph with destruction. Let's read from an official church manual directly off of the church's website.
Joseph Smith had been reluctant to enter plural marriage at first, fully realizing the persecution it would bring to the church. Monogamy was then the only form of marriage legally accepted in the United States, and opposition was sure to be fierce. Joseph himself had to be convinced of the propriety of plural marriage. 3 times an angel appeared to him, urging him to move forward as directed. He eventually entered plural marriage and introduced the principle to other followers in Nauvoo as early as 1841.
We are now expected to believe that God sent an angel with a drawn sword to threaten Joseph Smith if he did not marry between 30 and 40 women. Yet this same God remained absolutely silent for 150 years while the church implemented racist practices. And that's not to mention all of the other areas in this world that need an angel to be sent to help alleviate human suffering. Additionally, we are asked to believe that this God continues to give revelations that conveniently align with each prophet's own worldview, while ignoring the significant harm these leaders inflict on marginalized groups such as LGBTQ+ individuals, Black and Native communities, and women. This is the same God who stays his hand when the world goes to war and millions of people are executed in gas chambers. The same God who sends no angels while millions are destitute and hungry, barely surviving on a few dollars a day. This same God thought it so important that Joseph secretly married dozens of women, some of which were teenagers and some of which were already married, that he resorted to angelic threats. God sent this angel with a sword to coerce Joseph into manipulating up to 40 women into non-consensual sexual relationships. Again, from the Gospel Topics essay, we can read the following.
The exact number of women to whom he was sealed in his lifetime is unknown because the evidence is fragmentary. Careful estimates put the number between 30 and 40.
Many, many wives.
In Kirtland in the 1830s, Joseph Smith was caught having an affair with a teenage maid who he employed in his house named Fanny Alger. Emma was devastated, and Oliver Cowdery didn't even stand by Joseph during this time. Later in the 1840s, Joseph again used this same rationale to justify plural marriage, in order to appear to have divine sanction for illicit actions. Let's read from William McClellan, an early Mormon apostle, about that incident.
One night Emma missed Joseph and Fanny Alger. She went to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone. She looked through a crack and saw the transaction. She told me this story too was verily true.
And let's read from the Gospel Topics essay regarding Joseph Smith's illicit relationship with Fanny.
Fragmentary evidence suggests that Joseph Smith acted on the angel's first command by marrying a plural wife, Fanny Alger, in Kirtland, Ohio, in the mid-1830s. Several Latter-day Saints who had lived in Kirtland reported decades later that Joseph Smith had married Alger, who lived and worked in the Smith household, after he had obtained her consent and that of her parents. Little is known about this marriage, and nothing is known about the conversations between Joseph and Emma regarding Alger. After the marriage with Alger ended in separation, Joseph seems to have set the subject of plural marriage aside until after the church moved to Nauvoo, Illinois.
The Gospel Topics essay does its best to group the affair with Fanny into the plural marriage category. They even titled the essay Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo. But in reality, there are no recorded plural marriages in Kirtland. It only was documented later in Nauvoo. Church historians must assume there was a plural marriage with Fanny, but as everything was done in secret like an affair would be, there is no record of it, and the best the Gospel Topics essay can come up with is stating that fragmentary evidence suggests that Joseph married Fanny in Kirtland in the mid-1830s. In Mormon Historical Studies, Brian Hales wrote an entire book on this subject. Let's read an excerpt.
The historical record indicates that Joseph Smith contracted his first plural marriage in 1835 or 1836 in Kirtland, Ohio, with Fanny Alger. Upon learning of the relationship, his legal wife, Emma, and close friend Oliver Cowdery rejected it, considering it adulterous. Evidence supports that afterward the prophet taught no one about plural marriage or even mentioned the subject during the next 5 to 6 years.
The church and its apologists are redefining words here. Notice they're using plural marriage as a stand-in for an extramarital affair. They want to use the term plural marriage to mean any sexual relationship or secret sexual encounter that Joseph Smith had with anyone.
Many, many wives.
Let's read about that angel with a drawn sword from the Gospel Topics essay.
Joseph told associates that an angel appeared to him 3 times between 1834 and 1842 and commanded him to proceed with plural marriage when he hesitated to move forward. During the 3rd and final appearance, the angel came with a drawn sword, threatening Joseph with destruction unless he went forward and obeyed the commandment fully.
When else has God allegedly sent angels with drawn swords? Well, there's actually a couple of occurrences in the scriptures. The first is in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve were expelled for eating from the tree of knowledge. God placed cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the tree of life. This is apparently because if they too had eaten from the tree of life, it would have made God a liar. You know, when God said, if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, on that day you will die, and yet they didn't. Anyway, so I guess God uses an angel with a flaming sword to keep himself honest? Not really sure.
Who the hell knows?
Another similar instance is when Abraham was commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac. In this case, the angel appeared to stop Abraham's blade from killing his son. This was merely a test to prove Abraham, because God didn't want him to kill his promised son. There's a parallel here between Abraham and Joseph Smith, because there are a few instances of Joseph proposing marriage to others and then following up that it was just a test. One such example is with Heber C. Kimball, who after fasting for 3 days, agreed to let Joseph marry his wife Violet. But Joseph recanted the proposal, saying it was just a test, though the prophet did come away with their daughter Helen as a bride instead. In the Old Testament, God sent an angel with a sword to stop Balaam from going to Moab. Though Balaam couldn't see it, only his donkey could. The donkey ran into a wall, crushing Balaam's foot. So Balaam beat it until the Lord opened the mouth of the ass, and finally the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way, and his sword drawn in his hand. Like, folks, this totally happened.
Many, many wives.
Now, even some LDS Church historians question the authenticity of the angel with the drawn sword, since there are simply no contemporary first-hand accounts of it. Some of the accounts that we have are years after the alleged events and come second-hand. However, these same historians are quick to accept and defend other stories that are recorded after the fact, like the First Vision account, which wasn't recorded or discussed for over a decade and then changed over time as well. There are simply no accounts of the angel with the drawn sword that are contemporary to Joseph Smith, because all of his plural marriages were done in secret. The essay is very clear.
Many details about the early practice of plural marriage are unknown. Plural marriage was introduced among the early saints incrementally, and participants were asked to keep their actions confidential. They did not discuss their experiences publicly or in writing until after the Latter-day Saints had moved to Utah and church leaders had publicly acknowledged the practice. The historical record of early plural marriage is therefore thin. Few records of the time provide details, and later reminiscences are not always reliable. Some ambiguity will always accompany our knowledge about this issue. Like the participants, we see through a glass, darkly, and are asked to walk by faith.
Joseph simply didn't want anyone, including history, to know about his secret practices with multiple women. And why would there be a need for such secrecy? Most likely because he knew what he was doing. Joseph Smith was deeply manipulative, using his spiritual authority to gratify his sexual desires. Joseph used his gift of storytelling and his position as spiritual leader and authority to sexually manipulate women, not to mention men, husbands, and fathers, into doing his bidding, even when and especially if it didn't align with the gospel. The immorality of Joseph Smith's actions don't align with gospel teachings of his day, or any day for that matter. What's ironic is that the angel may have stayed his sword, but it certainly didn't offer protection when Joseph was in Carthage jail shortly after his plural marriage occurrences exploded by the dozens. God was apparently happy to allow men to kill his prophet, even though the Lord had groomed Joseph into an obedient servant. And even though God had used a destroying angel to pressure Joseph into secretly having more sex with more and more women.
Many, many wives.
The secrecy of Joseph's escapades kept many unaware. Joseph's brother Hiram spoke against the practice and even said that if an angel was enforcing the doctrine, the angel must be an impostor from the devil. This statement, recorded in Levi Richard's journal, would lead us to believe that either Hiram hadn't been brought into Joseph Smith's confidence, or that Hiram was just as good of a liar as his brother and was bound to secrecy.
There were many that had a great deal to say about the ancient order of things, as Solomon and David having many wives and concubines, but it is an abomination in the sight of God. If an angel from heaven should come and preach such doctrine, some would be sure to see his cloven foot and cloud of darkness overhead, though his garments might shine as white as snow. A man might have one wife, but concubines he should have none.
Hiram was Joseph's closest brother. Now, of course, it's possible that Joseph brought Hiram into the practice right after this. And the LDS Church does share the story of Hiram converting to the principle of plural marriage once his first wife died and he had remarried. Joseph taught him about sealings, and Hiram wanted to be sealed to both. And Joseph reasoned with him that this was no different than plural marriage. Joseph then told Hiram about a deceased friend who had visited him to persuade his widow to marry Hiram, her brother-in-law, as she was Hiram's second wife's sister. Thus we see that it isn't always angels and their swords who do convincing for Joseph, but he'll use whatever he needs to bring others to his side. Jed Woodworth sheds more light on this topic, and let's read from the church's website.
During that summer, an angel visited Joseph Smith. It was Robert Thompson, his former clerk. The angel appeared to Joseph several times, telling him that he did not wish me to live such a lonely life, Mercy recounted. The angel proposed a shocking solution. Hiram was to have me sealed to him for time, Mercy recalled. In other words, Robert Thompson requested that Hiram marry Mercy as a plural wife for this life, for time. Mercy and Robert, meanwhile, would remain sealed in the eternities.
Many, many wives.
Let's cover more instances of the angel with the flaming sword. In the 1888 biography of Heber C. Kimball, his grandson Orson F. Whitney records the following.
A grand and glorious principle had been revealed, and for years had slumbered in the breast of God's prophet, awaiting the time when, with safety to himself and the church, it might be confided to the sacred keeping of a chosen few. That time had now come. An angel with a flaming sword descended from the courts of glory and, confronting the prophet, commanded him in the name of the Lord to establish the principle so long concealed from the knowledge of the saints and of the world, that of plural marriage.
More than 20 accounts have been found from diverse individuals about an angel with a drawn sword visiting Joseph. Historians debate the veracity of some accounts, but they include many different witnesses, and at least 4 of Joseph Smith's plural wives are on record talking about the angel with the drawn sword. A couple of these accounts are even from apostles and future church presidents. And these accounts are confirmed by multiple sources, such as Lorenzo Snow and Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, who heard Smith recount the story.
Many wives.
Joseph F. Smith was Joseph Smith's nephew and later became president of the church. He wrote about the pressure that Joseph felt and his hesitance in practicing plural marriage.
Joseph Smith was commanded to take wives. He hesitated and postponed it, seeing the consequences and the trouble that it would bring, and he shrank from the responsibility. But he prayed to the Lord for it to pass as Jesus did. But Jesus had to drink it to the dregs, so it was with Joseph Smith. The Lord had revealed it to him, and said now is the time for it to be practiced, but it was not until he had been told he must practice it or be destroyed that he made the attempt.
Many wives.
And let's read another account of the angel from Joseph Lee Robinson, an early convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
The Lord, instead of releasing Joseph Smith from that burden, he sent an holy angel with a drawn sword unto him, saying unto him, Joseph, unless you go to and immediately teach that principle, namely polygamy or plural marriage, and put the same in practice, that he, Joseph, should be slain, for thus saith the Lord, that the time has now come that I will raise up seed unto me, as I spoke by my servant Jacob, as is recorded in the book of Mormon. Therefore, I command my people.
Many wives.
And here's another account of the angel from future Mormon prophet Lorenzo Snow.
Joseph Smith said that the Lord had revealed the doctrine of the plurality of wives unto him and commanded him to have women sealed to him as wives, that he foresaw the trouble that would follow and sought to turn away from the commandment, that an angel from heaven appeared before him with a drawn sword, threatening him with destruction unless he went forward and obeyed the commandment.
You can pause the screen right now to read yet 2 more statements by Lorenzo Snow about the angel with the flaming sword.
Many wives.
Benjamin F. Johnson was a confidant of Joseph Smith. He recorded the story of Joseph telling him about an angel with a sword, who had visited the prophet demanding obedience to the law of plural marriage.
Joseph Smith declared that an angel appeared unto him with a drawn sword, threatening to slay him if he did not proceed to fulfill the law that had been given to him.
And again, here are 2 more accounts of Benjamin F. Johnson's tale. You can pause the screen to read them for yourself.
many, many wives.
Eliza R. Snow was the sister of Lorenzo Snow. She played a significant role in the early history of the LDS Church. In June 1842, she secretly married Joseph Smith as a plural wife, a detail supported by various historical records. Later that summer, she organized a petition with over 1,000 female signatures refuting claims that Smith practiced polygamy. As secretary of the Ladies' Relief Society, she published a declaration in October 1842 denouncing polygamy. And despite this public stance, William Clayton records that Joseph Smith had married Eliza in February of 1843 as a plural wife. And after Joseph Smith's death in 1844, Eliza immediately married Brigham Young, remaining with Brother Brigham until his death in 1877.
Joseph Smith received the revelation in 1837, but he was himself afraid to promulgate it until the angel came and stood beside him with flaming sword and bade him do the command of God. Not until then did Joseph enter into polygamy or get any of his disciples to take plural wife.
And again, here's a couple more instances of Eliza Snow talking about the angel with the sword. Feel free to pause your screen.
Many, many wives.
Orson Pratt was an influential early leader in the Mormon Church. He joined the church in 1830, shortly after its founding, and he became one of the original members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in 1835. Pratt was a notable theologian, mathematician, and scientist who contributed significantly to LDS doctrine and scripture. He was instrumental in publishing church materials, including the 1879 edition of the Book of Mormon, which introduced chapter and verse divisions still used today. Pratt's intellectual approach sometimes led to tensions with other church leaders, including Brigham Young, especially regarding the nature of God and plural marriage. Orson Pratt practiced polygamy, having 10 wives and fathering many children. Orson Pratt was the first to publicly announce and defend the LDS Church's practice of polygamy, all under the direction of Brigham Young. In August 1852, during a special conference in Salt Lake City, Pratt delivered a discourse officially declaring that polygamy was a doctrine revealed by God to Joseph Smith. This event marks the church's first formal acknowledgement of the practice of polygamy, which had been observed secretly since at least the 1840s, or the 1830s if we include Joseph's affair with Fanny Alger. Pratt's address, known as the 1852 Revelation on Celestial Marriage, laid out theological justifications for polygamy, linking it to the restoration of ancient patriarchal practices and eternal salvation. This public declaration came after years of secrecy, during which polygamy was practiced quietly by Joseph Smith and select church leaders. Pratt's announcement sparked widespread controversy and contributed to the growing tensions between the LDS Church and the broader American society.
The angel of the Lord appeared unto the prophet Joseph with a drawn sword and declared that if he, Joseph, did not go to and teach and practice the holy commandment, he would slay him.
And here's one more instance of Orson Pratt talking about the angel with the sword.
I had a pleasant conversation of the trials of the prophet Joseph and first introducing the doctrine of celestial marriage in Nauvoo, and quoted the statement of the late apostle and church historian that the angel of the Lord appeared unto the prophet Joseph with a drawn sword and declared that if he, Joseph, did not go to and teach and practice the holy commandment, he would slay him.
Many, many wives.
Zina Huntington was known for her deep faith and complex personal life, which intersected with multiple prominent early church leaders. She joined the church with her family in the 1830s and traveled to Nauvoo, Illinois, where she became part of the inner circle of the LDS Church. In 1841, she married Henry Bailey Jacobs, but in 1842, she also became a secret wife of Joseph Smith. After Smith's death in 1844, she was then sealed to Brigham Young in 1846 for a time, although she continued her civil marriage to Jacobs before they ultimately separated. Let's hear what Zina said about the sword-bearing angel.
Zina Young told of Brother Joseph's remark in relation to the revelation on celestial marriage. How an angel came to him with a drawn sword, and said if he did not obey this law he would lose his priesthood, and in the keeping of it he, Joseph, did not know, but it would cost him his life.
And here's a couple more accounts of Zina talking about that angel with a sword.
Many, many wives.
Helen Kimball was the daughter of Heber C. Kimball, an early LDS Church leader and a close associate of Joseph Smith. In 1843, at the age of 14 years old, Helen was secretly sealed to Joseph Smith in a plural marriage, a practice that was kept deeply secret at the time. Helen later wrote extensively about this experience, describing her initial reluctance and the promises of eternal blessings tied to polygamy. Following Smith's death in 1844, Helen married Horace Whitney, with whom she had children including Orson F. Whitney, who became an LDS apostle. Helen was a significant voice in defending the practice of polygamy and documenting its practices in the early history of the church.
This angel, Joseph states, stood over him with a drawn sword prepared to inflict the penalty of death if he should be disobedient.
Many, many wives.
Erastus Snow was a prominent leader in the early church, and a key figure in the early colonization of Utah. As was required for many LDS leaders, Snow practiced polygamy. His polygamous family aligned with the church's practice under the teachings of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Snow's commitment to polygamy and his role as a church leader were integral to the early development of Mormon communities.
Spoke of the angel of the Lord meeting Joseph with a drawn sword, and of his going to slay him for his being neglectful in the discharges of his duties, and of Joseph having to plead on his knees before the angel for his life.
And here's another time where Erastus talked about the angel with the sword.
The prophet Joseph had said to Erastus Snow also, "I have not been obedient enough to this holy law, and the Lord was angry with me, and an angel met me with a drawn sword, but I pled with the Lord to forgive me, and he did so, and I made the sacrifice required of my hand, and by the help of the Lord I will obey his holy law."
Many, many wives.
Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner became a member of the LDS Church in 1830, shortly after its founding. She was heavily involved with the early days of the church, known for her role in saving the Book of Mormon manuscript pages during an early incident of persecution. She was married to a non-member, Adam Lightner, but moved to Nauvoo in the 1840s. As one of his secret wives, Mary was sealed to Joseph Smith in 1842. She was already married with children and in her early 30s when this sealing took place. And of course, Joseph was already married to several other women by then, and the practice of polygamy was becoming increasingly prominent within the LDS leadership. After Joseph Smith's death, Mary accepted the offer to be married to Brigham Young in 1845. Though she didn't marry Joseph until 1842, the prophet had longed for her for many years. Mary stated that Joseph had a private conversation with her about this when she was only 12 years old in 1831. Joseph told her that she was the first woman God commanded Joseph to take as a plural wife. In 1834, Joseph approached her again, but she instead married Adam Lightner in August 1835. Mary recounted that Joseph told her an angel had threatened to take his life unless he obeyed God's command to practice plural marriage. Mary said she would not marry Smith unless she obtained confirmation from God. After praying about it, Mary reported seeing an angel pass through her room. Mary agreed to marry Smith, but the sealing did not dissolve her marriage to Adam, her husband, though he was away at the time of the marriage, and it is still unclear if the marriage had his consent or even knowledge.
Joseph told me that he was afraid when the angel appeared to him and told him to take other wives. He hesitated, and the angel appeared to him the third time with a drawn sword in his hand and threatened his life if he did not fulfill the commandment.
There are many recorded instances of Mary talking about the angel with the sword. Feel free to pause the video. William Clayton was Joseph Smith's personal secretary, and he documented Joseph's claim of being visited with an angel with a sword. Later leaders, including Brigham Young and others, referenced these stories as part of their defense of plural marriage, emphasizing its divine mandate. And of course, the modern LDS Church has finally acknowledged Joseph's role in introducing polygamy.
Many, many wives.
Naturally, the introduction of polygamy caused significant turmoil and conflict, and the practice was kept secret for many years, even as public denials were issued. Both critics within and outside the church viewed polygamy as immoral and an abuse of power, especially given Joseph's marriages to young girls and women who were already married to other men. The LDS Church disavowed polygamy in 1890 and today views it as part of its historical narrative, emphasizing Joseph's supposed reluctance and divine compulsion. The church seeks to distance itself from the practice, and leaders state emphatically that there's no polygamy in the church. Here's a typical example when Gordon Hinckley talked about polygamy on the Larry King Show.
That's 118 years ago. It's behind us.
But when the word is mentioned, when you hear the word, you think Mormon, right? I mean,
you do mistakenly. They have no connection with us whatever. It has had nothing to do with it for a very long time. I have nothing to do with it.
You condemn it.
I condemn it, yes, as a practice because I think it is not doctrinal, it is not legal, And this church takes the position that we will abide by the law.
The story of Joseph Smith being commanded to practice polygamy under threat from an angel with a drawn sword is a key point in LDS church history. Joseph claimed that an angel appeared to him multiple times, commanding him under threat of destruction to practice polygamy. On one occasion, the angel reportedly held a drawn or flaming sword, threatening Joseph with destruction if he did not comply. This narrative has been cited to explain why Smith began practicing and teaching polygamy despite its controversial nature. The angel with a sword story has been interpreted as a way to absolve Joseph Smith of personal responsibility by framing polygamy as a commandment from God. It remains a highly debated topic among historians, theologians, and critics of the church. Joseph Smith reportedly resisted the command for some time due to the personal and social consequences. However, the angelic mandate has now been framed as a divine ultimatum, leaving him no choice but to comply. The initial introduction of polygamy occurred in Nauvoo, Illinois in the 1840s. Public acknowledgement of polygamy by the church did not occur until the 2010s. Critics view the multiple accounts of angelic visitations as merely a narrative used to justify the illicit practice, while believers often interpret these stories as evidence of Smith's role as a divine prophet, carrying out heavenly commands despite personal reluctance. This reminds me of one of those famous quotes by Susan B. Anthony.
I distrust those people who know so well what God wants them to do, because I notice it always coincides with their own desires.
Many, many wives.
We should be highly skeptical of those who claim to speak on behalf of invisible deities. Their motives simply can never be absolved, because of course the natural question is, if God really wants us to do something, rather than send an angel with a sword to the other person, why wouldn't this God just communicate with us directly? And this is an absolutely huge point. Notice the angel with the drawn sword is sent almost exclusively to Joseph and not to the women that he's supposed to marry. So what are your thoughts on Joseph Smith's claim that an armed angel forced him into practicing and teaching polygamy? Is there actual evidence that Joseph Smith was against the practice? Perhaps it makes more sense that he was never against it, but used his spiritual authority and position to coerce others into following his will. Now, Joseph can claim that he doesn't want to be intimate with dozens of women, but that's exactly what he did. Joseph has a long history of getting creative about getting his way. Would Joseph have been as persuasive to these women without the stories of angels and commands from God backing him up? And what would you do if you were approached by Joseph Smith to become his secret plural wife? Would an angel visiting him be enough to sway your mind? And what if Joseph approached you to marry your teenage daughter? How many angels would that take?